April 18th, 1942. 0320 hours. USS Hornet, North Pacific Ocean. The lookout's voice crackled through the bridge telephone. Surface contact, bearing 020 degrees, range 12,000 yards. Lieutenant Commander Frank Akers lowered his binoculars and reached for the ship's intercom. The Japanese picket boat Nito Maru had just sealed the fate of 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers lashed to the carrier's wooden flight deck. What none of them knew was that this chance encounter would trigger the first American bombing raid on the Japanese homeland, an operation so audacious that even its planners considered it a suicide mission. The Pacific dawn revealed mountainous waves crashing over the Hornet's bow. Wind speeds approached 40 knots. Visibility dropped to less than 5 miles in the driving rain. These were not the conditions Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle had trained for at Eglin Field. The launch point was still 650 nautical miles from Japan, 250 miles farther than planned. The calculations were sobering. Each B-25 carried 1,141 gallons of fuel. At maximum cruise efficiency, they might reach the Chinese coast. Maybe. The attack on Pearl Harbor had taught American military planners a fundamental truth about modern warfare. Geographic isolation no longer guaranteed security. If Japanese carrier aircraft could strike Hawaii without warning, then Japan itself must be equally vulnerable to American retaliation. The psychological equation was simple: strike the Japanese homeland and shatter the myth of imperial invincibility that had sustained Japanese expansion across the Pacific. President Franklin Roosevelt had demanded immediate retaliation after December 7, 1941. Not in 6 months. Not when America's industrial might could produce overwhelming force. Now. While American bodies still floated in Pearl Harbor's oil-slicked waters, while Japanese forces advanced unopposed across the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies, the American public needed proof that their nation could strike back. Admiral Ernest J. King, Chief of Naval Operations, understood the strategic implications. Japan's defensive perimeter stretched from the Kuril Islands to the Dutch East Indies, a chain of fortified islands and naval bases that would require years to penetrate using conventional tactics. But the Japanese homeland itself lay behind this defensive screen, protected by distance, early warning networks, and the fundamental assumption that no American bomber could reach Tokyo from any existing base. Captain Francis Lowe, operations officer on Admiral King's staff, had observed Army Air Force's bombers practicing carrier deck takeoffs at Naval Station Norfolk Chambers Field on January 10, 1942. The runway was painted with the outline of a carrier deck for landing practice. Twin-engine bombers launching from aircraft carriers. The concept violated every principle of naval aviation doctrine, but Lowe's observation sparked a revolution in strategic thinking. The USS Hornet displaced 19,800 tons standard, 25,500 tons fully loaded. Her flight deck stretched 809 feet in length, 86 feet in width. 4 Parsons-geared steam turbines generated 120,000 shaft horsepower, driving the carrier through Pacific swells at 32.5 knots. Captain Mark Andrew Mitchell commanded 2,919 officers and men, but on this mission, his ship would carry no Navy aircraft. Every available square foot of deck space was occupied by 16 U.S. Army Air Forces B-25B Mitchell medium bombers. Lieutenant Colonel James Harold Doolittle stood 5 feet 4 inches tall, but his reputation towered over American aviation. MIT doctorate in aeronautical engineering, winner of the Schneider Trophy, Thompson Trophy, and Bendix Trophy. First pilot to perform an outside loop, first to fly coast to coast in under 24 hours, first to take off, fly, and land using instruments alone. At 45 years old, Doolittle had spent more time in experimental aircraft than most pilots had spent in the air. The B-25B Mitchell bomber represented American industrial adaptation at its finest. Wingspan 67 feet 7 inches. Length 53 feet 6 inches. Empty weight 21,100 pounds. 2 Wright R2600-13 Cyclone engines, each producing 1,700 horsepower. Standard range 1,350 miles with a 3,000-pound bomb load. But standard specifications meant nothing on this mission. North American Aviation's engineers had performed mechanical surgery on each aircraft. The lower gun turret was removed, saving 600 pounds and eliminating the aerodynamic drag that cost precious fuel. Additional fuel tanks were installed in the bomb bay, crawlway and lower turret space, increasing capacity from 646 gallons to 1,141 gallons. The secret Norden bomb sight was replaced with a 20-cent device designed by Captain Charles Ross Greening, constructed from materials available at any hardware store. The logistics of the mission were unforgiving. A standard carrier takeoff required 500 feet of deck run. The B-25s would have 467 feet from the starting position to the bow. Wind over the deck would need to exceed 40 knots to generate sufficient lift. Each bomber weighed 31,000 pounds fully loaded, nearly twice the weight of the Navy's largest carrier aircraft. No Army bomber had ever launched from a carrier in combat. No medium bomber had ever attempted a mission requiring a 2,400-mile flight over water without fighter escort. The Japanese homeland defense system in April 1942 represented 3 years of careful planning and absolute confidence. The Imperial Japanese Navy's combined fleet controlled the Western Pacific from the Aleutians to Australia. Land-based aircraft provided overlapping coverage from chains of island bases. Submarine patrol lines monitored approaches to the home islands. But the first line of defense was more basic and supposedly foolproof. The picket boat line consisted of converted fishing vessels stationed at 50-mile intervals, extending 600 to 700 miles from the Japanese coast. Each boat carried radio equipment capable of transmitting contact reports to naval headquarters in Tokyo. The Nitomaru, officially listed as a 70-ton patrol vessel, was in reality a requisitioned fishing boat with a crew of 11 sailors and a single machine gun for defense. Her mission was simple: spot American ships and radio their position before being sunk. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commander of the First Air Fleet that had attacked Pearl Harbor, maintained that American carriers could not approach within 600 miles of Japan without detection. His 6 fleet carriers had demonstrated at Pearl Harbor, Darwin and Ceylon that carrier aviation was the decisive weapon of naval warfare. The nearest American bases capable of launching heavy bombers were in the Aleutians, over 2,000 miles from Tokyo. B-17 flying fortresses based in Australia were 3,000 miles away. The mathematics of fuel consumption and bomb load made any conventional bombing raid impossible. General Hideki Tojo, Prime Minister and War Minister, had assured Emperor Hirohito that the divine winds that had saved Japan from Mongol invasion would protect the homeland from American attack. The Japanese public had been told that their islands were surrounded by an impenetrable defensive screen. Enemy aircraft would never darken Japanese skies. This absolute certainty would make the psychological impact of the Doolittle Raid even more devastating than its physical damage. At 0310 hours on April 18th, the radar operator aboard USS Enterprise reported surface contact bearing 028 degrees, range 21,000 yards. The contact was tracking southwest at 9 knots, directly across Task Force 16's intended track. Admiral William Frederick Halsey, commanding from Enterprise, faced an immediate decision: continue toward the launch point and risk detection, or launch immediately from beyond optimal range. The Japanese picket boat Nitomaru had spotted the American task force at 0530. Radio operator Seaman First Class Nakamura transmitted the contact report. 3 enemy carriers sighted. Position 650 nautical miles east of Inubosaki. Course west, speed 20 knots. The message was garbled by atmospheric interference, but enough reached Tokyo to trigger an alert. USS Nashville opened fire at 0538, her 6-inch guns straddling the picket boat with the second salvo. Nitomaru burned and sank within minutes, but her warning had been transmitted. Halsey made the only decision possible: launch immediately or abort the mission entirely. At 6:20 he signalled Hornet, "Launch planes," to Colonel Doolittle and his gallant command, "Good luck and God bless you." Doolittle's B-25, tail number 40-2344, was positioned 467 feet from the bow. Navy Launch Officer Lieutenant Henry Miller stood at the port side of the deck, timing the carrier's pitch in the 30-foot swells. As Hornet's bow reached the bottom of a trough, Miller swung his checkered flag in a circle, the signal to advance throttles to maximum power. Flight Engineer Staff Sergeant Paul Leonard watched the engine instruments as cylinder head temperatures climbed toward redline. Co-pilot Lieutenant Richard Cole called out airspeed as the bomber accelerated down the spray-soaked deck. 40 knots, 50, 60. The white line marking the edge of the deck rushed toward them. At 0820, with less than 50 feet of deck remaining, Doolittle pulled back on the control yoke. The B-25 staggered into the air, dipped toward the waves as it lost the wind bursting over the carrier's bow, then slowly climbed into the grey Pacific dawn. 15 more bombers would follow at 4-minute intervals. Lieutenant Travis Hoover's aircraft cleared the deck with 10 feet to spare. Lieutenant Robert Gray's bomber dropped so low after launch that spray from the prop wash soaked the tail gunner's position. Captain David Jones watched green water break over his windscreen before achieving positive climb. Every pilot performed a miracle of aviation, launching overloaded bombers from a pitching deck into gale-force winds. The 16 B-25s flew individually toward Japan, maintaining radio silence and flying at wave-top height to avoid radar detection. Navigation was by dead reckoning, magnetic compass, and drift meter. No radio beacons, no weather updates, no fighter escort. Each 5-man crew was alone over 650 miles of hostile ocean. Lieutenant Colonel Doolittle's bomber reached the Japanese coast at 12:30 hours local time. Navigator Lieutenant Henry Potter had calculated their position within 5 miles, despite flying through rain squalls and variable winds. The crew could see Japanese civilians waving from fishing boats, apparently believing the low-flying bomber was a Japanese patrol aircraft. The false gun barrels installed in the tail cones had achieved their deception purpose. Tokyo's air raid warning system had been activated at 900 based on the Nitomaru's report, but stood down at noon when no enemy aircraft appeared. The population of 6.5 million was conducting normal Saturday activities when Doolittle's bombardier, Staff Sergeant Fred Bramer, opened the bomb bay doors at 13:15 hours. 4 500-pound incendiary clusters dropped from 1,200 feet, spreading across 10 city blocks in the Shitaya district. Lieutenant Travis Hoover's crew bombed the Tokyo Special Steel Company factory complex 30 seconds later. The powder works exploded in a column of flame visible from 20 miles away. Lieutenant Robert Gray struck the Tokyo Gas and Electric Company engineering facility. Lieutenant Everett Holstrom hit the Ogura Oil Company refinery. Captain David Jones dropped his bombs on military warehouses in the Yokohama district. Each bomber carried a specific target folder, but weather, navigation errors, and anti-aircraft fire forced rapid tactical decisions. The second wave of bombers arrived over Japan between 1300 and 1400 hours. Lieutenant Dean Hallmark, piloting the Green Hornet, struck the steel mills at Yokohama despite heavy anti-aircraft fire. Lieutenant Ted Lawson bombed the Nippon Machinery Works. Lieutenant Harold Watson hit the Tokyo Naval Arsenal. Lieutenant Richard Joyce struck the Japan Special Steel Company. Each crew reported successful bomb runs, though damage assessment was impossible while flying at maximum speed toward the Chinese coast. Captain Edward York faced mechanical failure 200 miles from Japan. His B-25's left engine was consuming fuel at twice the normal rate. Unable to reach China, York turned northwest toward Soviet territory, landing at Vladivostok after a 6-hour flight. The crew would spend 14 months in Soviet internment, a diplomatic complication that Moscow handled by officially denying their presence while privately treating them as guests. Lieutenant William Farrow's bomber arrived over Nagoya as air defense fighters were scrambling from Kasumigara Naval Air Station. 9 Mitsubishi, A-6M0 fighters pursued Farrow's B-25, but the bomber's low altitude and maximum speed prevented effective interception. Corporal Jacob de Shazer released 4 incendiary clusters over the Mitsubishi aircraft factory, destroying the paint shop and damaging the assembly building. The psychological impact multiplied with each bomb explosion. Tokyo had not heard air raid sirens since the Great Kanto earthquake of 1923. Children ran from schools. Office workers fled into streets. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo was inspecting military bases during the raid when one B-25 came so close that Tojo could see the pilot, though the American bomber never fired at him. The raid had shattered the illusion of Japanese invulnerability. As the B-25s turned toward China, fuel gauges dropped toward empty faster than calculated. Headwinds exceeding 25 knots increased fuel consumption beyond worst-case planning. The Chinese airfield at Chuchao, supposedly ready to receive the bombers with homing beacons and runway lights, remained dark and silent. Radio calls went unanswered. The crews faced an impossible choice: bail out over unknown territory or attempt water landings in darkness. Lieutenant Ted Lawson's B-25 struck the water at 110 miles per hour, attempting a controlled ditching. The impact tore the bomber in half, throwing Lawson through the windscreen. His injuries included a compound fracture of the left leg, severe lacerations to his face, and multiple broken teeth. Navigator Lieutenant Charles McClure pulled the unconscious pilot from the sinking aircraft. Gunner David Thatcher swam repeatedly into the fuselage to rescue equipment and medical supplies. The Chinese military had not been informed of the raid due to security concerns and communication failures. General Chiang Kai-shek learned of the mission only when bombers began arriving over Chinese territory. Chinese ground forces, mistaking the B-25s for Japanese bombers, opened fire with anti-aircraft weapons. Lieutenant Donald Smith's bomber was hit by ground fire near Nanchang, forcing the crew to bail out over Japanese-occupied territory. Weather conditions over China deteriorated rapidly after sunset. Cloud ceilings dropped to 500 feet. Visibility decreased to less than 1 mile. Mountain peaks rose to 6,000 feet along the planned route. Without radio beacons or accurate maps, crews flew by instinct and luck. Fuel exhaustion became inevitable as gauges touched empty between 2,200 and 2,400 hours. Lieutenant Harold Watson ordered his crew to bail out at 11,000 feet when both engines quit from fuel starvation. The 5 men landed across 20 miles of mountainous terrain in Zhejiang province. Watson's parachute caught in a tree, leaving him suspended 30 feet above ground in freezing rain. He hung for 6 hours before Chinese farmers heard his shouts and cut him down. Lieutenant Dean Hallmark's crew represented one of the final tests of the mission's success. After bombing Yokohama, Hallmark flew the Green Hornet west toward China as darkness fell. Navigator Lieutenant Chase Nielsen calculated they had passed the Chinese coast, but no airfields appeared. Fuel gauges read empty. Both engines were running on vapor. At 23:45 hours, Hallmark gave the order: prepare for crash landing. The B-25 struck the water near the Chinese coast with devastating force. The impact threw Hallmark against the instrument panel, causing severe head injuries. Co-pilot Lieutenant Robert Mader was knocked unconscious. Bombardier Staff Sergeant William Dieter and Engineer Corporal Donald Fitzmaurice drowned in the sinking aircraft. Nielsen managed to escape through the broken canopy and pull Hallmark and Mader to shore. Lieutenant William Farrow's crew faced similar disaster. After bombing Nagoya, Farrow's bomber ran out of fuel over Chinese territory. The crew bailed out into complete darkness at 8,000 feet. Bombardier Corporal Jacob DeShazer landed in a rice paddy filled with human waste used as fertilizer. Covered in excrement, lost and unable to speak Chinese, DeShazer wandered for hours before encountering a Japanese patrol. He would spend 40 months in solitary confinement, tortured repeatedly for information about American carriers. Farrow and Navigator Lieutenant George Barr were captured within hours of landing. Engineer Sergeant Harold Spatz was beaten unconscious by Japanese soldiers who found him hiding in a Buddhist temple. Co-pilot Lieutenant Robert Hite was captured while seeking help from Chinese villagers who had been threatened with execution if they aided American airmen. The Japanese response was swift and brutal. Emperor Hirohito personally ordered that captured airmen be executed as war criminals. The Doolittle Raiders had not worn military uniforms during the raid, technically making them spies under international law. 8 captured crewmen were subjected to mock trials in Shanghai. Lieutenants Farrow and Hallmark, along with Sergeant Spatz, were executed by firing squad on October 15, 1942. The remaining 5 were sentenced to life imprisonment. 69 of the 80 Doolittle Raiders eventually reached safety in free China. 3 died in crash landings or drowning. 8 were captured by Japanese forces. 1 crew was interned in the Soviet Union. Every single B-25 was lost, destroyed in crashes or abandoned to prevent capture. The material damage to Japan was minimal: 50 dead, 252 wounded, 112 buildings destroyed or damaged. Lieutenant Colonel Doolittle considered the raid a failure. Standing in a Chinese rice field beside his crashed bomber, he told his crew he expected court-martial for losing the entire force. "I've lost all 16 planes. The mission was supposed to boost American morale, and all I've done is prove bombers can't operate from carriers." His engineer, Staff Sergeant Paul Leonard, replied, "Colonel, you've just won the Medal of Honor." The Japanese Navy's reaction was immediate and catastrophic for their long-term strategy. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, had been eating breakfast when informed of the raid. He remained silent for 30 minutes, then issued orders that would lead to Japan's first major defeat. The Midway operation, previously considered unnecessary by the Naval General Staff, was approved immediately. Yamamoto was determined to destroy the American carriers that had humiliated the Japanese Navy. President Roosevelt announced the raid to the American public with calculated misdirection. When asked where the bombers had launched from, he smiled and said, "Shangri-La," referencing the fictional Himalayan paradise from James Hilton's novel. The American public, desperate for good news after months of defeats, celebrated the first strike against the Japanese homeland. War bond sales increased 20% in the week following the announcement. The Doolittle Raid's strategic impact far exceeded its physical damage. 4 Japanese Army fighter groups were recalled from the Southwest Pacific to defend the homeland. These squadrons were desperately needed in New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, where their absence contributed to American victories at Coral Sea and Guadalcanal. The Japanese Navy accelerated the Midway operation by 6 weeks, allowing insufficient time for proper planning and coordination. The Chinese paid the highest price for American success. Japanese forces launched Operation Seigo, a retaliatory campaign in Zhejiang and Jiangxi provinces where Doolittle's crews had landed. General Shunroku Hata deployed 100,000 troops with orders to destroy all Chinese who might have aided the Americans. Entire villages were burned. Wells were poisoned with cholera and typhoid bacteria. An estimated 250,000 Chinese civilians died in the 3-month campaign of systematic extermination. The technological lessons transformed American bombing doctrine. The success of low-level attack profiles led to development of skip bombing techniques that would devastate Japanese shipping. The B-25's performance inspired modifications that created the heavily armed Strafer variants used throughout the Pacific War. North American aviation engineers developed the B-25G and H models with 75mm cannon mounted in the nose, turning medium bombers into flying artillery pieces. Admiral Yamamoto's obsession with eliminating the American carrier threat led directly to the Battle of Midway on June 4, 1942. The Japanese Navy committed 4 fleet carriers to the operation, convinced that overwhelming force would achieve decisive victory. American codebreakers, reading Japanese naval communications, positioned 3 carriers for an ambush. In 5 minutes, dive bombers from USS Enterprise and USS Yorktown destroyed carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, was sunk hours later. The loss of 4 fleet carriers and their experienced aircrew at Midway represented damage from which the Japanese Navy never recovered. The ships could be replaced, though slowly. The pilots could not. Years of training and combat experience vanished beneath Pacific waves. The tactical advantage in carrier aviation shifted permanently to the United States. This strategic reversal traced directly to 16 B-25s, launched from USS Hornet on a stormy April morning. Lieutenant Colonel Doolittle received the Medal of Honor from President Roosevelt at the White House on May 19, 1942. Promoted directly to Brigadier General, skipping the rank of Colonel, he would command the 12th Air Force in North Africa, the 15th Air Force in the Mediterranean, and finally the 8th Air Force in England. Every member of the raid received the Distinguished Flying Cross. The Chinese government awarded the raiders the Order of the Cloud and Banner. The human cost resonated through decades. Lieutenant Ted Lawson's memoir, 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, became a bestseller and Hollywood film. Corporal Jacob DeShazer, after 40 months of Japanese captivity, returned to Japan as a missionary, eventually converting one of his former prison guards to Christianity. Lieutenant Richard Cole, Doolittle's co-pilot, lived to age 103, passing away in 2019 as the last surviving Doolittle Raider. The technical specifications that made the raid possible became military doctrine. Carrier-based aviation evolved from fleet defense to power projection. The concept of joint operations between Army and Navy forces, revolutionary in 1942, became standard practice. Special operations requiring extreme range and minimal support traced their heritage to 16 bombers launching into an impossible mission. Japanese military historians would later identify the Doolittle Raid as the psychological turning point of the Pacific War. Not Pearl Harbor, which had energized Japanese confidence. Not Midway, which was still 2 months away. But the moment when American bombers appeared over Tokyo, proving that the ocean barriers that had protected Japan for 1,000 years meant nothing in the age of carrier aviation. The execution of the 3 Doolittle Raiders haunted the Japanese military command. Lieutenant Dean Hallmark, barely able to stand due to his injuries, had walked to his execution with dignity. At 4:30 p.m. on October 15, 1942, at Public Cemetery No. 1 outside Shanghai, Hallmark, Farrow and Spatz were tied to small crosses and blindfolded. Given a moment for silent prayer, they were then shot by firing squad. Their bodies were cremated, considered by the Japanese to be the ultimate dishonor. Lieutenant Robert Mader, Hallmark's co-pilot who survived the crash, died in captivity on December 1, 1943, from malnutrition and dysentery. The surviving prisoners, Nielsen, Haidt, Barr and DeShazer, endured 3.5 years of torture, starvation and solitary confinement before liberation in August 1945. Their survival was attributed to mutual support, a smuggled Bible, and sheer determination to outlive their captors. The operational statistics remained staggering even in retrospect. 16 bombers weighing 31,000 pounds each, launching from a carrier deck in 40-knot winds and 30-foot seas. Flying 650 miles to targets they had never seen, navigating by compass and intuition. Dropping 64,000 pounds of ordnance across 5 Japanese cities in broad daylight. Then flying another 1,500 miles to attempted landings in darkness over unknown terrain. The USS Hornet would survive only 6 more months after launching the Doolittle Raiders. Sunk at the Battle of Santa Cruz Islands on October 26, 1942, She took 140 aircraft and 111 crew members to the bottom of the Pacific. But her legacy was secured on April 18th when 16 Army bombers accomplished what Japanese military planners had declared impossible. The Doolittle Raid represented more than a military operation. It demonstrated that creativity could overcome numerical disadvantage, that courage could substitute for resources, that 16 aircraft could change the strategic balance of the world's largest war. The Japanese learned that their homeland was vulnerable. The Americans learned that they could win. Both lessons would shape the Pacific War's bloody progression toward Tokyo Bay and unconditional surrender. In the archives of the National Museum of the United States Air Force, a twisted piece of aluminum bears the serial number 40-2267. It is all that remains of Lieutenant Edgar McElroy's B-25, recovered from a Chinese mountainside in 1962. The metal is scarred by impact and weathered by decades of exposure. But forensic analysis revealed traces of Tokyo factory smoke embedded in the aluminum, molecular evidence of a mission that proved heavy bombers could launch from aircraft carriers and change the course of history. The final measure of the Doolittle Raid's impact came from an unexpected source. In 1959, Prince Nobuhito Takamatsu, Emperor Hirohito's brother, attended a reunion of Doolittle's raiders in Tucson, Arizona. Asked why he had come, the prince replied, "Your 16 planes changed our world." They proved that courage and innovation could defeat tradition and expectation. The bombs you dropped on Tokyo were small. The ideas you dropped were devastating. Every modern carrier aircraft launching from American flight decks carries the heritage of April 18, 1942. Every joint service operation builds on the precedent established when Army Air Forces and Navy personnel proved that service boundaries meant nothing when national survival was at stake. The Doolittle Raid did not win the Pacific War. It proved the Pacific War could be won. The 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers that launched from USS Hornet carried more than bombs and fuel. They carried the concentrated will of a nation that had been bloodied but not broken. They carried the promise that geographic distance provided no sanctuary from American retaliation. They carried the future of carrier aviation, special operations, and joint service cooperation. Most importantly, they carried proof that in modern warfare, the impossible was merely difficult, and the difficult was merely Tuesday.